Eventually, it would turn out that there was around 10,000 bone fragments scattered around the property. There has never been an investigation of human remains on this level ever in American history, except for one other case, and that was the identification of victims at the World Trade Center.
Investigators also found shotgun shells, a set of handcuffs, and evidence of charred bones.
This may not be as well known as the likes of Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer, but the scale of this awful killing spree and the scope of the investigation to now identify as many victims as possible is as large as those cases. This is Murder Maps.
Today we will be plotting out every detail of the Fox Hollow Farms murders on a map.
My name is Rachel Sharp and I am the crime correspondent for dailymail.com.
A forensic anthropologist from IU led a team of 60 volunteers through a heavily wooded area today.
Proceed!
There's a lot of still unanswered questions in terms of what exactly happened, how many victims there are, and who those victims are. And I think what is interesting with this is that for decades, no one was bothering to find out who these victims were and get answers for the families. So there's still a lot more investigation to be done. Herb Baumeister is linked to many deaths throughout the Midwest. However, many of them are still unsolved. Let's start with the plot of the murders. In November 1994, Herb Baumeister's son Eric and his friend were playing in the woods at the back of the family's estate. There they stumbled across a human skull. So here is Fox Hollow Farm estate.
When you look up the farm on Street View, you actually can't get directly to it. This is East 156th Street, which runs just north of the farm, and here is what the front of the house looks like now.
They took the skull to Herb Baumeister's wife, Julie, and showed it to her. She went back with the boys to where they'd found it, and they actually found an entire human skeleton. So this is a map of the Fox Hollow Farm estate and the backyard. It was 18 acres estate, and the two boys found the skull somewhere in this wooded area.
And here's what we found online when you look up satellite images of the backyard.
Julie asked her husband about the findings. He said that the skeleton was actually an old medical skeleton belonging to his father. His father had been a successful anesthesiologist. Julie actually threw the remains in the trash, and that was the end of it for about 2 more years. Herb was also an eccentric, so it perhaps wasn't out of the ordinary for him to have kept something like that. Fox Hollow Farm is in Westfield, which is in Hamilton County in Indiana. Westfield was a very exclusive, a very affluent area. The area was the kind of place that people were happy to let their children play out. It was a very safe area. And so here is Westfield on the map. It's approximately 16 miles north of Indianapolis. Fox Hollow Farm was an old horse farm. It was set on 18 acres of land. Much of it is a lot of woods, the perfect place to hide a lot of bodies. They moved to the property in around 1991, and that was where they brought up their 3 children. In January 1996, Julie filed for divorce from Herb. Around that time, the mask seemed to have started slipping. Up until then, she said that she felt they were living as a perfect family. They had successful businesses, they had 3 children, they lived on this huge, beautiful estate. However, behind the scenes, Herb could be quite controlling. The businesses were actually failing, and she revealed later that during their 24 years of marriage, they'd actually only been intimate 6 times. She filed for divorce in 1996. In the winter of 95, police began to approach both Herb and Julie to ask them to gain access to Fox Hollow Farm to search the estate. At the time, Julie said no. However, obviously 2 years earlier, she had come across that entire human skeleton in the grounds of the estate. In June 1996, she finally contacted the police and told them about that discovery that her son had made 2 years earlier, and she gave them permission to search the property.
In this case, forensic anthropologists have found 3 left wrist bones, again of help in determining age and size.
Almost as soon as police began to search the property, they found human remains scattered across the land. There was skulls, there was leg bones, there was tiny fragments, there was also shotgun shells, there was handcuffs, things that seemed to be tools, suggesting what had taken place there.
The woods have yielded more bones and more bodies. This latest discovery only deepens the mystery about the identity of the victims and the reasons why they never made it out of this gently rolling estate in Hamilton County.
A lot of the remains were burned and ground down and charred before they had been scattered around the grounds. The number of victims is currently unclear. However, authorities estimate that there could be at least 25 victims there. I mean, that number of potential victims is just absolutely staggering. And the fact that all these years on we still don't know who many of those people are is just also unfathomable. Investigators believe that the crimes were committed whilst Julie and their 3 children were out of town. She would often take the children away for the summer, and it was around that time that many young men began going missing. So while his wife and children were out of town, Herb Baumeister would visit the gay bars in downtown Indianapolis, where he would prey on young men. Herb Baumeister would pick up usually young gay and bisexual men from these bars in downtown Indianapolis and take them back to Fox Hollow Farm Estate. There, it is believed that he would strangle them before burning their bodies and scattering their remains around the land. So here is Massachusetts Avenue, and this was a hotspot for bars at the time.
Here is what Mass Ave in Indianapolis looks like now when you click through on Street View. It's still a cultural centre in the city. And here are some older archival photos of the street.
A lot of young men were going missing after going to the LGBT bars in Massachusetts Avenue. A lot of people would report seeing them leaving with a mystery man or sometimes getting into a mystery vehicle and never being seen again. So the members of the LGBT community started to notice a trend. They started noticing that their friends were disappearing, but police weren't necessarily taking it as seriously as they should. The community said they very much felt like they were on their own in this. They were putting up posters in the local bars. They were trying to advise each other and trying to really sound the alarm about the dangers that someone could be in what was deemed to be a safe space, that there was perhaps a serial killer lurking. So at the time, it was the 90s, it was the height of the AIDS crisis, and this was also a very conservative area. So members of the community felt that police weren't really taking it seriously, but there was also another issue going on here as well. Because of the time, some of the men who would often come to these bars were perhaps estranged from their families, or their families didn't know they were in the downtown Indianapolis area. They didn't know about their sexuality, and so no one necessarily reported all of these young men missing. So this is Massachusetts Avenue, and that was around 26 miles from Herb Baumeister's Fox Hollow Farm estate. This investigation into all the remains that were found at Fox Hollow Farm then led to Herb Baumeister also being connected to a string of other murders which spanned Ohio and Indiana. We'll touch more on that later. Now we're going to look at the accused. Okay, a lot of maps. Herb Baumeister's double life was starting to come to the forefront. He had for years presented as a family man, a married father of 3, a successful businessman. However, he was going through a divorce, his businesses were failing, and soon he was about to be exposed as one of the worst serial killers in America. Herb Baumeister was born in Indianapolis in 1947. He was the oldest of 4 children, and his father was an anesthesiologist. As you remember, his dad being a doctor was used as an excuse for that first discovery of human remains. His family lived in the Butler-Tarkington neighborhood, which is just right outside Indianapolis. Because of his dad's success as a doctor, the family moved to Washington Township. Herb Baumeister seemed to have a fairly normal childhood. He came from a good family. As we say, his father became more successful as a doctor. However, he started to show bizarre behaviours quite early on. Baumeister went to North Central High School.
So here is Herb Baumeister's high school on Street View. It's still there today, right off of East 86th Street in Washington Township.
And it was here that he started to show more antisocial behaviour. At one point, his parents were called into the school because he had left a dead crow on a teacher's desk and then urinated on it. He was also said to have a lot of emotional outbursts in class. It seems like the warning signs were perhaps starting to take shape. So it does seem like his family were trying to get him some sort of help. His father sought psychiatric treatment for him during that time. In 1965, Herb Baumeister attended Indiana University. However, he only stayed for one semester before dropping out. In 1972, he returned to university, this time to Butler University, but again, he only stayed for one semester. Before he launched his own thrift stores, Herb Baumeister worked for some time for the Indiana Bureau of Motor Vehicles. He was there for around a decade, however, he was then fired for urinating on a letter which was supposed to be sent to the then governor. We've seen this behaviour before. He also had a brief stint as a copy boy at the Indianapolis Star, which would later report on his horrific crimes. So Herb and Julie were married in 1971. They had 3 children together, and after several years, they moved to Westfield, Indiana, where they bought the Fox Hollow Farm estate. Julie later revealed that during their 24-year marriage, they'd only actually been intimate around 6 times, and she'd never actually seen him naked. So in 1988, Herb Baumeister borrowed around $4,000 from his mom and launched the first of 2 Save-A-Lot thrift stores. The business was an instant success, and he and Julie then also set up a second store as well. The first store he opened in 1988, and that was just here.
This was the location of Herb Baumeister's first thrift store. Here's what we can see on Street View today. It was in what is now a shopping centre along 82nd Street, northeast of Indianapolis. When we clicked through the parking lot a bit, we found that the former thrift store owned by Baumeister is now a Vietnamese food market.
The first store was such a success that they actually opened a second store around here, just 19 miles away.
The second store that Baumeister and his wife opened used to be right here, but was demolished in the late 90s.
Because of the success of the thrift stores, the Baumeisters could afford to move to the 18-acre Fox Hollow Farm estate. Now let's map out the investigation. As mentioned before, it was the winter of 1994 when Baumeister's son found a human skull and then ultimately human skeleton in the grounds of Fox Hollow Farm Estate. And just as a reminder, so here is Fox Hollow Farm Estate, and it was somewhere in the woods that the skull was found. So in the early 90s, multiple men were going missing from the downtown Indianapolis area. Many of the men were gay or bisexual, they were aged around 18 to 35, and they were last seen around the downtown Indianapolis gay bars. So a break came in the case into the disappearances of all of these young men when a man named Mark Goodyear came forward and said that he had an encounter with a man named Brian Smart. So this is Massachusetts Avenue. This is where Mark Goodyear said that he met Brian Smart. According to Goodyear, he had met Smart in one of the bars in downtown Indianapolis and gone back with him to a large farm or estate out of the Indianapolis area. There, he said he had gone down into the basement where there was a large pool. Around that pool was a bizarre setup. There was mannequins staged to look like people. Once in the pool, Goodyear claimed that the man known as Brian Smart had tried to strangle him with a pool hose. Goodyear managed to escape and went on to tell police what had happened. This tip was huge in eventually leading back to Baumeister. But for the next almost 2 years, they were unable to find this Brian Smart. And then sometime later, Goodyear told police that he had spotted this mystery man again and taken down his license plate. This license plate was then found to be a match to Herb Baumeister. After getting that tip, police asked both Herb and Julie for access to Fox Hollow Farm. They both said no. Police continued to press Julie, and eventually, after she filed for divorce, she said yes.
The Hamilton County Police were called yesterday because someone at the Fox Hollow Farm made a discovery.
During the search of the property, investigators quickly found human remains. There were skulls, there was bone fragments, there was also shotgun shells and handcuffs found scattered around the property. Eventually, it would turn out that there was around 10,000 bone fragments scattered around the property, which is just a crazy amount. During that initial search, investigators were able to identify 8 victims among the thousands of human remains. In 1998, 2 years after the discovery of Fox Hollow Farm, Herb Baumeister was also linked to a string of other murders. The I-70 Strangler. From 1980 to 1991, the I-70 Strangler had killed at least 9 victims and dumped their bodies along Interstate 70, which ran between Indiana and Ohio. At the time, those murders were all unsolved. So here is the I-70 here, and this is where bodies were popping up between the 80s and early 90s. Curiously, 1991 was when Fox Hollow Farm estate was bought by the Baumeisters. So the theory is that Baumeister in 1991 found a new graveyard for his victims. However, not everyone is buying that theory. Some members of the LGBT community believe that it was perhaps a little bit convenient to be able to link Baumeister to those murders. There was no concrete evidence actually tying him to those killings. And there was also other serial killers preying on the gay community at that time. The only firm evidence tying Baumeister to any of those killings is that one eyewitness was shown his picture following the discovery of Fox Hollow Farm and said that he matched the description of the man he saw leaving with one of the victims. Now let's take a closer look at the victims.
The 10 victims identified so far from the remains on the Fox Hollow Farm property are John Lee Bayer, Stephen Hale, Jeffrey Allen Jones, Richard Hamilton, Mike Kean, Alan Broussard, Roger Goodlett, Manuel Resendez, Alan Lee Livingston, and Daniel Thomas Halloran.
So back in the 90s, 8 victims were identified, and then for the following almost 3 decades, the thousands of human remains were then left to sit on a shelf at the University of Indianapolis with no names and no identities. In 2022, a new investigation was launched by Hamilton County Coroner Jeff Jellison. That investigation came out of a request from a family member of a man who had gone missing back in the 90s. He had contacted the coroner and asked him to look into the case. The coroner did so, and the first victim he was able to identify was actually that family's loved one. So Alan Livingston was identified in 2023 as the 9th victim of Fox Hollow Farm. Then, just 2 weeks before we are filming this, another victim has been identified. Daniel Thomas Halloran, who was identified as the 10th victim. Very little is actually known about Daniel Halloran and when he met Herb Baumeister or how he ended up at Fox Hollow Farm. He was born in the 60s and would have been around 30 at the time of the Fox Hollow Farm killings. Before he was identified as a victim, Daniel Halloran was never linked to this case at all. He hadn't been reported missing, he had become estranged from his family, and so no one had reported him missing. He was eventually identified using investigative genetic genealogy. He had a young daughter who has finally got some answers as to what happened to her father. So investigators believe that there are many more victims out there that are yet to be identified. The Hamilton County Coroner has revealed to Daily Mail that he has 3 more DNA profiles, so that is at least 3 more victims who will soon have their names back. The I-70 Strangler case remains unsolved, but what we do know is that at least 9 victims have been identified. Let's talk about the aftermath of this case. So in June 1996, when police had descended on Fox Hollow Farm and a warrant was out for Herb Baumeister's arrest, he fled to Ontario, Canada. Indianapolis to Ontario is around 376 miles. Just a couple of days later, on July 3rd, Herb Baumeister's body was found in Pinery Provincial Park in Ontario. He died by suicide. So this is Pinery Provincial Park where Herb Baumeister died. Baumeister left behind a 3-page suicide note. In it, he expressed regret for his failing businesses. He also apologized for messing up the park by killing himself there. But he made no mention of his crimes or any of the victims. He took his secrets to the grave. His suicide and the lack of mention of the victims at Fox Hollow Farm has led to questions to continue about the case all of these years on. Exactly how many victims he had remains a mystery, but there's also other questions as well around whether he definitely acted alone. The sheer number of victims, the number of bodies, the physical toll it would have taken has led to questions as to whether he may have had an accomplice. There has also been questions about the only known survivor, Mark Goodyear. Goodyear has denied any involvement. In a recent interview for a documentary, he denied any involvement. However, he did admit that he lied about the exact circumstances of his relationship with Baumeister. Goodyear has never been charged in connection to the case. Another mystery with this case is a trove of missing videotapes, which seemed to mysteriously disappear around the time that Herb Baumeister also did. His wife Julie said that he had a stash of videotapes inside the home. When investigators searched Fox Hollow Farm, they found a vent had been disturbed just above the pool area of the basement. They've long believed that a camera was placed there and that Baumeister was filming the murders of his victims. So following Baumeister's suicide, in 1998, investigators stopped looking into the victims and what had happened at Fox Hollow Farm. Decades later, in 2022, Hamilton County Coroner Jeff Jellison reopened an investigation into the thousands of human remains. Since then, him and his team have been working to identify the remaining victims. So here is where Fox Hollow Farm is in Westfield. And here is the Hamilton County Coroner's Office, around 8.6 miles away. Since the investigation was launched in 2022, this case is getting more attention. Tips are coming in from family members of missing loved ones, hoping to get answers as to whether their family members could be among the victims at Fox Hollow Farm. There are still an unknown number of victims out there. The Hamilton County Coroner is encouraging families whose loved ones went missing in the 80s and the 90s to come forward and submit their DNA so that they can be tested for comparison with the human remains found at Fox Hollow Farm. Now it's important to identify as many victims as possible to bring some sort of closure or answers to the victims' families.